Home is where the heart is. The night pressed against the windshield like a living thing, thick and wet, smearing the edges of the world in shadows. Elliot Grayson squinted into the beam of his headlights, watching the faint glow of his van's high beams carve out a path through the rain. It was a dead road at a dead hour, with nothing but the rhythmic slap of the wipers and the dull hum of the engine to keep him company. That was how he liked it. Silence. Stillness. They made it easier to avoid the thoughts that crept up in crowded spaces, the ones that sounded too much like his own voice. He reached the curve on Willow Street without realizing it, the road pulling him into its embrace as if steering for him. The van groaned slightly as it leaned into the turn, and then he saw it, just for an instant. A house, its silhouette stark against the horizon like the husk of some long-dead creature. Elliot hadn't slowed down, but time seemed to stretch. He caught details as his headlights skimmed the edges of the property. The brittle iron gate clinging to its hinges, the bowed roof line sagging under decades of neglect, the hollow windows that seemed to watch him back. He blinked. By the time his brain registered what he'd seen, the house was already behind him, swallowed by the night. A cold ripple passed through him, and then the sound came. At first, he thought it was static from the radio, a faint, scratchy buzz that hummed just below hearing. But it grew louder, a whisper threading through the low noise of the engine and the rain. It wasn't coming from outside the van. It was coming from everywhere at once. Elliot. His chest tightened, his foot hovering over the brake. The whisper was unmistakable now, slipping through the cracks in his mind like smoke, curling in his ears with the weight of something ancient. He glanced into the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone sitting in the back seat. Empty. Just the faint outline of his own shoulders, his face barely visible in the glass. Yet something felt wrong about his reflection, as though it didn't quite move when he did. The van's tires skidded slightly as he pressed too hard on the brake. His hand went instinctively to the gear shift, trembling. He forced himself to focus, to shake off the uneasy fog that crept in with the whisper. He'd been tired lately. Too tired. It was nothing. But as the van idled, rain streaking down the glass, he heard it again. Closer this time. Softer. Elliot. It wasn't a voice he recognized, but it spoke with the weight of someone who knew him, someone who had always been there. He shook his head, anger sparking through his fear. "No," he muttered, shifting the van into gear. "Not tonight." The wheels spat water as he drove off, his knuckles pale against the wheel. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. The house was burned into his mind now, as vivid as if he'd lived there. He would dream of it that night, of its empty halls and the windows that watched him, of the faint, rhythmic tapping that crept closer and closer until it was right outside his door. And just before waking, he would hear it one last time. Elliot. Elliot woke up to the tapping. It was a delicate rhythm, soft as the rain against the window, yet distinct enough to carve itself into his awareness. He lay in the dark for a moment, heart thudding in his chest, trying to place it. The sound wasn't inside the room. It was coming from beyond the thin walls of his apartment, just outside. Tap, tap, pause, tap. He forced himself to breathe, dragging a hand over his face. It was probably a branch against the siding, or one of the loose gutters swaying in the wind. He told himself that twice, but neither explanation took root. The pattern was too deliberate. Elliot rose, the floor cold beneath his feet. The rain had turned heavier, drumming against the glass. He stared at the window for a long moment, hesitant to pull back the curtain. He couldn't say why, but the thought of what might be waiting beyond that thin veil of fabric turned his stomach. Instead, he retreated to the kitchen. The fluorescent bulb flickered as he flicked the switch, washing the room in a harsh light. He poured a glass of water with trembling hands, gripping the edge of the sink to steady himself. The night felt too still, too heavy, like the world was holding its breath. Then he saw it, the faintest outline of a shadow just outside the kitchen window. It was there and gone in an instant, as if someone had passed by. His pulse surged, sending the glass clattering into the sink. Elliot stumbled back, his breath hitching. He waited, eyes glued to the rain-streaked glass, but nothing moved. Just the faint reflection of his own pale face staring back at him. When he finally worked up the nerve to move closer, his gaze caught on something. A small smudge in the condensation. 4 faint streaks, like the marks of fingers dragged down the glass. Elliot jerked away, swallowing hard. He didn't know what compelled him, but he reached for the door to his back patio, throwing it open to the rain. The cold air hit him like a slap, carrying the sharp scent of wet asphalt and earth. The small yard behind his apartment was empty. No sign of movement, no footprints in the soft mud. And yet, as he stood there, letting the rain soak through his shirt, he felt the weight of something watching him. Elliot barely slept that night. The tapping stopped after he shut the door, but the feeling didn't leave him. He stayed on the couch, the TV humming softly in the background, its glow casting restless shadows across the room. He was determined to forget it, to write it off as exhaustion or an overactive imagination. But as the hours stretched on, his thoughts kept circling back to one thing: the house on Willow Street. It had wormed its way into his mind, the image of its crooked silhouette flickering like an afterimage burned into his retinas. He tried not to think about how familiar it had felt, like something he'd seen in a dream but couldn't quite recall. At some point, exhaustion overtook him, and he slipped into a fitful sleep. He dreamed of a hallway that stretched on forever, its wallpaper peeling and its floorboards warped. The air smelled of rot, and the only sound was the faint tap, tap, tap of footsteps in the distance. He turned to run, but no matter how fast he moved, the hallway stretched farther, the walls closing in. When he woke, just before dawn, there was a single word etched into the condensation on his living room window: "Come." Elliot wasn't sure why he went back. The thought gnawed at him all morning, a persistent itch beneath his skin. Logic told him to ignore it, to let the house rot in its corner of the neighborhood and get on with his life. But something deeper, more primal, pulled at him. By the time he reached Willow Street, the rain had stopped, leaving behind a dull grey mist that hung over the cracked pavement. The neighborhood was silent, the kind of silence that made his ears strain for sound. He slowed the van as he approached the bend, his stomach twisting as the house came into view. It was worse in the daylight. The sagging roofline seemed heavier, the boarded windows more hollow. Weeds choked the front yard, clawing their way up the iron gate, which hung open just slightly, as though inviting him in. The house seemed to lean toward him, its warped siding curling inward like a sneer. Elliot parked across the street, his hands gripping the wheel tightly. The whispers hadn't returned, not since last night, but the silence was worse. He felt it pressing against him, heavy and expectant, like the world was holding its breath. Before he could stop himself, he was out of the van. The air was damp and cold, carrying the faint smell of mildew and earth. The gate creaked as he pushed it open, its hinges groaning like an old man rising from a chair. Gravel crunched under his boots as he stepped onto the overgrown path leading to the front door. The house loomed larger as he approached, its details sharpening. The wood of the porch was splintered and sagging, the door warped and discolored with age. But it wasn't the decay that unsettled him. It was the sense of wrongness, as though the house were aware of his approach. He reached the door and hesitated. His hand hovered over the knob, the cold metal slick with dew. A voice in his head screamed at him to turn around, to get back in the van and forget this place forever. But his body didn't listen. It felt like he was moving through someone else's will, his fingers curling around the knob and twisting. The door swung open with a hollow groan. The air inside hit him like a wall, thick and damp, carrying the faint, acrid tang of rot. The dim light filtering through the cracks in the boards painted the interior in shades of grey and brown. The floor was covered in dust and debris, but there was something strange about the way it settled. It wasn't random. It looked deliberate, like the pattern of ash after a fire. The layout was simple. A narrow hallway stretching into the darkness, with doorways branching off on either side. Elliot stepped inside, the floor creaking under his weight, and let the door close behind him. The sound echoed far longer than it should have. The air felt heavier here, pressing against his chest and making it hard to breathe. He moved slowly, his boots leaving faint impressions in the dust. He couldn't explain why, but he felt like he needed to be quiet, as though something might hear him. One of the doorways caught his attention. It led to what looked like a living room, though the furniture was little more than skeletal remains, rotted wood and sagging upholstery. A broken mirror hung on the far wall, its surface warped and tarnished. Elliot froze when he saw his reflection. It was him, but it wasn't. The figure in the mirror stood just slightly out of sync, its movements delayed by a fraction of a second. And there was something else. Something small, barely noticeable. A faint shadow just behind him, where nothing should have been. He spun around, heart hammering, but the room was empty. The air shifted. A whisper slid through the silence, so faint it might have been the creak of the house settling. But it wasn't. He knew it wasn't. Welcome home. Elliot staggered back, his breath catching in his throat. He stumbled out of the room back into the hallway and nearly tripped over something on the floor. Looking down, he saw a photograph. It was faded and warped, the edges curling, but the image was clear. A man standing on the front porch of the house, smiling. The man was him. Elliot's stomach lurched. His hand shot out to brace himself against the wall, but it wasn't wood his fingers touched. It was warm, damp, and faintly pulsing, like flesh. He bolted for the door, his heartbeat pounding in his ears. The house groaned as he ran, the hallway seeming to stretch and twist, its angles warping impossibly. By the time he reached the front door, his vision was swimming, his chest tight with panic. The door wouldn't open. No matter how hard he pulled, it wouldn't budge. Then he felt it. A faint vibration beneath his feet, like something moving deep within the house. The whispers grew louder, overlapping. A chorus of voices speaking in a language he couldn't understand. "Let me out," he shouted, slamming his fists against the door. His voice sounded small and hollow, swallowed by the house's endless hum. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the noise stopped. The door swung open. Elliot tumbled out onto the porch, gasping for air. The house loomed behind him, silent and still, as though nothing had happened. He didn't look back as he ran to the van, his hands shaking as he fumbled with the keys. But as he pulled away, speeding down the empty street, a single thought burned in his mind. The house knew me. Elliot couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed him home. By the time he reached his apartment, the streetlights had begun their jittery flicker, their orange glow casting trembling shadows on the wet pavement. Inside, the air was stale, thick with the faint smell of mildew he hadn't noticed before. He closed the door and bolted it with shaking hands, but the lock gave him no comfort. His boots tracked mud across the floor as he collapsed into the chair by the window. He told himself he needed to catch his breath, to let the weight of the house slide off his shoulders, but deep down, he knew it wasn't that simple. The whispers hadn't returned, but silence could be worse. His eyes darted to the clock. Midnight. The house lingered in his mind like a bruise, tender to the touch. Every detail, its sagging facade, the warped walls, the photograph of himself, spun in his thoughts like a carousel he couldn't stop. He reached for the television remote, desperate for noise, but the static that buzzed to life on the screen only made his chest tighten. The faintest creak came from the kitchen. Elliot froze, his fingers tightening around the remote. He told himself it was just the building settling. It was an old apartment. Pipes knocked, floors groaned. But something about the sound didn't sit right. It wasn't random. It was deliberate. A step. He stood slowly, the blood draining from his face as the creaking moved closer. His pulse roared in his ears as he approached the kitchen, his every nerve screaming to turn around. When he rounded the corner, the sight waiting for him made his stomach drop. The photograph from the house was sitting on the counter. It hadn't been there when he'd left that morning. He was certain of it. The paper looked even older now, the edges blackened and brittle, as though it had been burned. His own face stared back at him, unchanged, the faint smile carved into his lips as he stood on the house's porch. But the background had changed. The front yard was darker now, the sky above it thick with unnatural clouds, and behind him, barely visible in the shadows of the doorway, was a figure. Elliot staggered back, knocking over a chair. The photograph fluttered to the floor, landing face up, but he couldn't bring himself to touch it. His hands shook uncontrollably as his breath quickened. "Not possible," he whispered to no one. The creaking started again, louder now, moving down the hallway toward him. The sound was heavier than footsteps, as though something far larger than a person was dragging itself along the floorboards. Elliot stumbled backward, his heel catching on the edge of the doorway, and he landed hard on the floor. The hallway stretched before him, impossibly long. He blinked, and the length of it seemed to shift, the edges of the walls warping like a heat mirage. A shadow moved at the far end, indistinct, but wrong. Too tall, too thin. It didn't walk so much as undulate, like it was testing the boundaries of its form. And then the whisper returned. "Home." Elliot scrambled backward, his palms scraping against the rough floor. The word hung in the air, heavy and wet, like it had been pulled from somewhere deep inside him. The shadow grew closer, the hall collapsing in on itself as it moved. With a sudden jolt, he found himself back in the kitchen, his head snapping toward the clock on the wall. 2 hours had passed. The photograph was gone. Elliot didn't sleep that night. He sat by the window, staring out into the flickering glow of the streetlights, his thoughts spiraling into chaos. He tried to tell himself it was stress, exhaustion, anything to explain the impossible. But deep down, He knew the truth. The house wasn't done with him. It had found its way into his mind, his life, and it wasn't going to leave. When the first light of dawn bled through the blinds, Elliot made his decision. He wasn't going to let it fester any longer. He had to go back. The air on Willow Street was colder than Elliot remembered. The overcast sky hung low, pressing down on the neighborhood like a shroud. His van idled on the shoulder as he sat, gripping the wheel, his knuckles pale and tight. The house waited just beyond the cracked pavement, its silhouette hunched like a predator coiled to strike. He didn't want to go back. Every rational part of him screamed to leave, to forget the house and whatever was happening to him. But he couldn't. It wasn't just the photograph or the shadow in the hall. It was something deeper, an ache in his chest that whispered he wouldn't find peace until he stepped inside again. This time, the gate didn't creak. It was open wider than before, almost expectant. The gravel path crunched under his boots as he approached, each step dragging more than the last, as if the ground itself resisted him. The house loomed larger than he remembered, its walls seeming to swell and ripple in the corner of his vision. He kept his eyes forward, forcing himself up the steps and onto the sagging porch. The door was already open. Inside, the air was thicker than before, humid and faintly sour, like a room that had been sealed shut for too long. The hallway stretched ahead of him, longer and darker than it should have been. The same warped grey light filtered through the cracks in the boarded windows, but now it seemed to move, shifting across the walls in ways that didn't align with the angles of the room. Elliot's footsteps echoed too loudly as he stepped inside. The sound reverberated, growing softer, but never quite disappearing, as though it were swallowed by the house itself. He forced himself deeper, his gaze darting to each door he passed, expecting something to emerge. Each room was worse than the last, empty, but filled with the weight of something unseen, something waiting just beyond the edges of perception. The whispers returned as he entered the living room. This time, they weren't words, just faint murmurs overlapping, sliding through his ears like oil. They were coming from everywhere and nowhere, threading through the cracks in the walls and the gaps beneath the floorboards. He felt them on his skin, cold and slick, like invisible tendrils brushing against him. The broken mirror still hung on the far wall, its surface darker now, as though the glass had been replaced with something far older, far deeper. He stared at it, his breath catching as he saw his reflection again. It was wrong, distorted, the edges of his face rippling like water. And there, standing behind him, was the shadow. He didn't turn around. He couldn't. The weight of the house pressed against his back, rooting him in place. The shadow in the mirror didn't move, but it grew sharper, its edges solidifying, the faint suggestion of limbs and a face emerging from the void. And then it leaned forward. A voice, low, guttural, and impossibly close, spoke into his ear. "You were never meant to leave." Elliot spun, his breath catching in his throat, but the room was empty. The whispers faded, replaced by the heavy, suffocating silence. He stumbled backward, clutching his chest as his heart pounded. The photograph lay on the floor by his feet, pristine and untarnished now. He didn't want to pick it up, but his hand moved on its own, lifting the image to his face. It was the same photo as before, him, standing on the porch. But the background was different again. This time, the door behind him was open, and the figure was closer. It stood just inside the threshold, its elongated fingers reaching out toward him. The house groaned, the sound deep and resonant, vibrating through his bones. The walls seemed to close in, warping and shifting like something alive. He ran for the door, the photograph slipping from his fingers. But when he reached it, the knob wouldn't turn. "Let me out," he shouted, slamming his fists against the wood. The whispers returned, rising in volume, overlapping into a cacophony of voices. They were inside his head, behind his eyes, crawling through his thoughts. The house shook with a deep, rumbling laugh. Elliot turned, pressing his back against the door as the walls rippled and shifted. The hallway stretched impossibly long, the shadows at the far end crawling toward him. They didn't rush, they didn't need to. They moved with the inevitability of the tide, engulfing the space inch by inch. The door behind him swung open without warning, and he stumbled backward, collapsing onto the porch. He gasped for air, scrambling to his feet as he turned to face the house. It stood silent and still, as though nothing had happened. But as he backed away, his eyes caught something in the second-story window, a faint outline, watching him. Elliot didn't stop running until he was back in his van, the engine roaring to life as he tore down the street. He didn't look back, but he didn't need to. The house had let him go, for now. Elliot barely made it through the night. His apartment felt wrong, smaller somehow, like the walls were inching closer every time he blinked. He couldn't sit still. Every creak of the floorboards or sigh of the wind outside sent his nerves fraying. It wasn't just his paranoia. He was certain something had followed him. Morning brought no reprieve. The sunlight bleeding through the blinds was pale and sickly, casting shadows that felt sharper than they should. He tried to sleep, but his dreams had been nothing but fragmented memories of the house, of its dark hallways and shifting rooms. Worse, he couldn't shake the feeling that the dreams hadn't been entirely his own. It started in the kitchen. Elliot had tried to distract himself with the mundane, a pot of coffee, some toast he didn't touch. But as he reached for a mug, his gaze caught on the refrigerator. The magnets that usually held coupons and takeout menus in place were scattered across the floor, their messages rearranged into nonsensical patterns. He frowned, leaning closer. The words on the papers had changed. Not scribbled over, not cut out and replaced. Just changed, like the letters had shifted when he wasn't looking. He stared at a coupon for car repairs, his breath hitching as the letters rearranged themselves right in front of him. "Come back." Elliot stumbled back, his hip hitting the counter hard enough to bruise. The paper fluttered to the floor, the magnets scattering like insects fleeing the light. His heart pounded as he backed out of the kitchen, his eyes darting to every shadow, every dark corner of the room. He grabbed his phone, his thumb hovering over the call button. But who would he call? What could he even say? The next sound stopped him cold. It was faint, barely audible above the hum of the refrigerator. But it was there, a creak, like weight shifting on old wood. It wasn't coming from outside or from the hall. It was coming from his bedroom. He approached slowly, his palms slick with sweat, his breath catching in his throat. The door was ajar, swinging slightly with each step he took. The air inside the room felt wrong, colder than the rest of the apartment, with a faint metallic tang that made his stomach churn. And then he saw it. The mirror on his dresser, the one he avoided looking at on most days, now faced him directly. Its surface rippled faintly, as though it were a shallow pool disturbed by a single drop. Elliot froze, his hand gripping the edge of the doorframe as the ripples settled into a reflection that wasn't his own. It was the house. The mirror didn't show his cluttered bedroom, his unmade bed, or the pile of laundry in the corner. It showed the hallway of the house on Willow Street, stretching endlessly into the dark. And there, at the farthest edge of the reflection, a shadow moved. Elliot's breath hitched. The shadow grew sharper, clearer, taking slow, deliberate steps toward the mirror's surface. It didn't walk like a person. Its limbs were too long, its gait too fluid, like it was adjusting to a body it wasn't meant to inhabit. He tried to move, to tear his gaze away, but his legs felt like lead. The shadow stopped just before reaching the edge of the reflection, its face obscured by the dim light of the hallway. And then, without warning, its head snapped upward. It was looking at him. The mirror cracked with a sharp, deafening sound, a jagged fracture splitting it down the middle. Elliot staggered back, his chest heaving, as shards of glass fell to the floor. The reflection was gone, replaced by his own pale, wide-eyed face staring back at him. But as he turned to leave, he saw it, just for a moment. A figure standing in the corner of the room, tall and thin, watching him with an intensity that made his skin crawl. When he blinked, it was gone. Elliot didn't remember deciding to go back to the house. One moment, he was pacing his apartment, every muscle in his body taut with unease. And the next, he was standing on the cracked sidewalk of Willow Street, staring up at its crooked silhouette. The house was different. It had always been wrong, too still, too heavy, but now it seemed alive. The boards over the windows were bowed outward, as though something inside was pressing against them. The front door stood slightly ajar, its dark interior yawning like a mouth waiting to swallow him. Elliot stepped forward, his boots crunching on the gravel path. He didn't try to resist. The pull was too strong, and the whisper in his mind, soft and rhythmic, had dulled his fear to a distant hum. He crossed the threshold, the door swinging shut behind him with a groan that sounded far too much like a sigh. The house had changed again. The hallway stretched longer than it had before, the light seeping through the cracks in the boards, casting thin, spidery shadows along the walls. Dust hung thick in the air, catching the light like motes of ash. The whispers started almost immediately, soft and overlapping, their words just beyond comprehension. Elliot followed the hallway, his breath shallow, his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides. He told himself he was in control, that he could leave whenever he wanted. But with every step, the house seemed to grow heavier around him, the air pressing against his chest like water. At the end of the hallway, a door waited. It hadn't been there before. The door was different from the others. Where the rest of the house was warped and rotted, this door was pristine, its surface smooth and dark, with no handle or hinges. A faint vibration hummed through the air as Elliot approached, the whispers growing louder. Without thinking, he reached out and pushed. The room beyond was small and empty, its walls lined with crumbling bookshelves. The air was stale, carrying the faint scent of mildew and decay. In the center of the room, atop a low wooden table, sat a single object, a journal. Elliot stepped closer, his eyes fixed on the book. Its cover was faded and cracked, the leather worn thin around the edges. He picked it up carefully, the weight of it strange in his hands, and opened it to the first page. The handwriting was small and precise, but the ink had bled and faded, making most of the words unreadable. What he could make out sent a chill through him. I was here before you. I thought I could escape. I was wrong. Elliot's pulse quickened. He flipped to the next page, then the next. Each entry was more frantic than the last, the writing devolving into jagged, slashing lines. Phrases jumped out at him like splinters. It's not a house. It knows me. There is no leaving. It won't let you. The final entry was written in thick, uneven strokes, as though the author had been trembling. The house becomes you. A deep, resonant groan reverberated through the room, and Elliot's head snapped up. The bookshelves seemed to warp and shift, their shapes bending inward as though the walls themselves were closing in. The whispers surged louder now, their overlapping voices forming a single, coherent word. Stay. Elliot stumbled back, the journal slipping from his hands and hitting the floor with a dull thud. The room pulsed around him, the walls rippling like a living thing. Shadows bled from the corners, pooling across the floor and climbing the walls. He bolted for the door, his breath ragged, his heart hammering in his chest. The hallway was longer now, its far end swallowed in darkness. Elliot ran, his footsteps echoing endlessly, the whispers chasing him, growing louder with every step. He didn't look back. He couldn't. By the time he burst through the front door, the whispers had stopped. The air outside was cool and still, the overcast sky casting the street in muted grey. He stood on the porch, gasping for air, his hands trembling. The house loomed behind him, silent and still, as though mocking him. But when he glanced down, he saw it, the journal, clutched tightly in his left hand. Elliot sat in his van, the journal resting heavily on the passenger seat. He hadn't opened it again since leaving the house. He didn't need to. The words were burned into his mind. He could still feel the weight of the whispers, the suffocating pressure of the house's presence, as if it were clinging to him, just out of sight. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long, skeletal shadows across the road. He hadn't driven far, only as far as his instincts allowed. He was parked on a quiet side street, the kind where the houses all looked the same, neat and suburban. But even here, away from Willow Street, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The journal. He couldn't leave it untouched. It wasn't just curiosity. It was something deeper, something primal. A part of him knew that whatever answers he sought were in those pages. With trembling hands, he flipped it open again. The handwriting seemed to shift as he read, the lines bending and twisting in the corners of his vision. At first, it was the same fractured, frantic scrawl, but as he turned the pages, the entries became more erratic. The dates didn't make sense. Days, months, and years jumbled together in impossible sequences. One entry stopped him cold. Today I saw myself. I was younger, standing at the door, staring inside. I tried to call out, but I couldn't speak. It didn't matter. He didn't hear me. I don't think I was real to him. Elliot's breath hitched. He turned the page, his hands slick with sweat. The next entry was shorter, almost a fragment. I walked down the hallway. The pictures on the walls were of me, but I didn't remember any of them being taken. My reflection watched me, but I wasn't moving. I think I've been here before. I think I've always been here. The words blurred, and Elliot blinked hard, his vision swimming. The air in the van felt thicker now, the faint smell of mildew creeping in. He glanced at the windshield and froze. The street outside was gone. It wasn't darkness outside the van, but something worse. The world had shifted into a distorted grey haze, as though the fabric of reality had been stripped away. Shapes twisted and writhed in the mist. Vague, half-formed suggestions of buildings, trees, and streets that dissolved if he looked directly at them. Elliot's pulse thundered in his ears as he stared out the window. The mist was moving, pulling itself closer in slow, deliberate waves. He turned the key in the ignition, but the van wouldn't start. The engine groaned, a deep mechanical whine that sounded more like a wounded animal than a machine. The journal fell from his lap, landing open on the floor. He didn't want to look, but his eyes were drawn to the page. The writing had changed. "Look up." Elliot's head snapped upward, and his heart plummeted. The rear-view mirror reflected not the inside of the van, but the hallway of the house. The same warped, endless corridor stretched into the distance, its walls peeling and its floorboards warped. And there, standing at the far end, was himself. He was younger in the reflection, his hair darker, his posture straighter. He was standing at the threshold of the hallway, staring into the darkness. Elliot watched, paralyzed, as the reflection turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows. The mist outside thickened, curling around the van and blotting out what little light remained. Elliot's chest tightened as he fumbled for the door handle. He stumbled out onto the ground, his knees hitting something that wasn't pavement, but wasn't quite dirt either. The texture was soft and pliable, almost fleshy, and his stomach churned as he realized it pulsed faintly beneath his hands. The whispers returned. They weren't faint this time. They roared through the mist, overlapping and discordant, each word a blade dragging across his mind. He couldn't move, couldn't think, as the sound consumed him. And then, as quickly as it had started, it stopped. Elliot looked up. The mist had parted just enough to reveal the outline of a house. It wasn't Willow Street anymore. It wasn't anywhere he recognized. The house stood alone, massive and wrong, its angles bending in ways that made his eyes ache. The door was open. It was waiting for him. Elliot stood at the edge of the mist, his heart racing, staring at the house that loomed in the distance. It didn't belong here. Neither did he. The air felt heavy and still, muffling every sound except for the faint hum that pulsed beneath his feet like a heartbeat. The open door seemed to call to him, but Elliot refused to move. Not yet. He needed to think, to fight. Fumbling with shaking hands, he pulled his phone from his pocket. He had to call someone, anyone. His thumb hovered over his mother's number, the name familiar and comforting in a way that felt impossibly distant. The line rang once, twice, then clicked. "Hello?" Her voice was warm, sleepy. For a moment, Elliot's chest loosened. He opened his mouth to respond, but before he could speak, she added, "Who is this?" The words hit him like a slap. "It's me," he stammered. "Mom, it's Elliot." There was a long silence on the other end, the kind that wasn't just hesitation, but confusion, disbelief. "I'm sorry," she said finally, her voice tinged with unease. "I think you have the wrong number." The call ended before he could say another word. Elliot's breath came in short, panicked bursts as he stared at the phone screen. The number was correct. He tried calling again, then again, but the result was the same. His mother didn't recognize his voice, his name, or anything about him. Desperate, he dialed his co-worker, the only person who might pick up at this hour. The call connected, and Elliot could hear the faint noise of the other man's television in the background. "Who is this?" came the voice, groggy and annoyed. "It's Elliot," his voice cracked. "We work together. You see me every day. Please, I need your help." There was no response, just the faint static of the line. Then, "I don't know an Elliot." The line clicked dead. Elliot dropped the phone, his legs giving out beneath him as he sank to the ground. The whispers returned, soft at first, threading through his mind like a familiar song. They grew louder with each passing second, their words overlapping until they formed something coherent. You are nothing. You are no one. The mist around him shifted, pulling back to reveal a landscape that wasn't a landscape at all. The ground beneath him was gone, replaced by an endless expanse of black, shifting like water but firm under his touch. The house remained, its sharp angles and warped silhouette, the only solid thing in the void. Elliot forced himself to stand, his knees trembling. He didn't know what else to do. His reflection in the van's side mirror had disappeared, replaced by nothing but the distorted shapes of the mist around him. The whispers seemed to press closer now, their voices coming from inside his own mind. And then he saw the photographs. They were scattered across the ground, dozens of them, their glossy surfaces reflecting the dim, sourceless light. Each one was the same, a portrait of him standing in front of the house, his expression vacant, his eyes staring straight ahead. But they weren't all the same version of him. In some, he was older, his face lined with age. In others, he was younger, almost unrecognizable. One showed him as a child, clutching a toy he hadn't thought about in decades. Elliot knelt, his hand shaking as he picked up one of the photographs. The house in the background looked newer, less decayed. The door was open, and in the shadow of the entryway, he could just make out a figure watching him. It wasn't his own shadow. The whispers shifted, growing sharper, angrier. "You cannot leave," they hissed. "You belong here." Elliot dropped the photograph and turned toward the house. Its door had swung wider, the black void beyond it, swallowing the faint light around it. The mist surged, tendrils of it curling around his feet, pulling him closer. He tried to resist, but his body wouldn't obey. Each step forward felt heavier, his will eroding under the weight of the house's presence. As he reached the porch, he looked back one last time, hoping, praying for something to anchor him. But the van was gone, the ground beneath it a smooth, endless expanse of black. His mind raced, grasping for something, anything that would tether him to the life he knew. But every name, every face, every memory slipped through his grasp like sand. When he stepped inside the house, the door closed behind him, with a sound that wasn't a slam, but a heartbeat. Elliot stood in the center of the house's entry hall, the door behind him sealed as though it had never existed. The air was thicker now, suffocating and humid, and the faint scent of rot that had lingered before was sharper, more alive. Shadows crawled along the edges of his vision, flitting like insects, disappearing the moment he turned his head. The whispers were louder here. They moved through the walls, beneath the floorboards, wrapping around him in a suffocating cocoon. But now they were clearer, no longer a garbled mess of voices. They spoke in words he couldn't avoid, words that burrowed into his mind. "You belong to us." The hallway stretched ahead of him, impossibly long. It seemed to shift and pulse as though the house itself were breathing, its warped angles bending farther into something unrecognizable. Elliot's legs moved on their own, his boots dragging against the uneven floor. He passed doorways that hadn't been there before, each one cracked open just enough to show glimpses of things he couldn't bear to look at. Twisted shapes hunched in the darkness, faces staring back at him with eyes too large and too empty. "Let me go," Elliot whispered, his voice trembling. It was the first thing he'd said aloud since stepping back inside. The house answered with a low groan, the sound resonating through his chest. The hallway ended at a door. It was the same door he'd seen before, the one that was too perfect, too untouched by time. The dark wood shimmered faintly in the dim light, its surface smooth and unbroken. There were no hinges, no knob, just a flat plane of wood that seemed to hum with a low vibration. Elliot reached out, his fingers brushing against it. The moment his skin made contact, a sharp, searing pain shot through his arm, and he stumbled back with a cry. The whispers erupted into a cacophony of laughter, a sound that filled every inch of the house. It wasn't human. It wasn't even remotely close. It was the sound of something vast and ancient, something that delighted in his suffering. "You cannot leave," the voice boomed, no longer a whisper. It came from everywhere, shaking the walls and the floor. "You are home." Elliot turned to run, but the hallway was gone. The house had shifted around him, its walls folding into themselves like a collapsing maze. He was in a room now, a large, empty expanse, lit by a faint, sourceless light. The floor beneath him wasn't wood anymore. It was soft and pulsing, a pale, fleshy surface that quivered beneath his weight. The laughter came again, louder this time, and Elliot fell to his knees, clutching his head. It wasn't just a sound. It was inside him, scraping against his thoughts, filling every corner of his mind with its mocking tone. "I'm not yours," he shouted, his voice breaking. "I'm not." The room darkened, the walls closing in. From the farthest corner, a shadow began to take shape. It moved with a sick, fluid grace, its limbs stretching and contracting as though it were made of liquid and smoke. It had no face, just a smooth black void where one should have been, but its presence was suffocating. "You have always been ours," the voice said, softer now, more intimate. The shadow moved closer, its form shifting and twisting. "You were made for us." Elliot scrambled backward, his hands slipping on the pulsing floor. He could feel the house inside him now, clawing at his memories, erasing and rewriting them in real time. He tried to hold on to something, anything, but every face, every moment, every shred of who he was slipped away like water through his fingers. The shadow loomed over him, its form bending and expanding until it filled his vision. And then, in a voice that wasn't a voice but a vibration that shook the very core of his being, it spoke one final word. "Stay." Elliot's world went dark. He woke on the front lawn of the house, the early morning sun casting weak rays through the mist. His clothes were damp, his hands scraped and raw, but the pain was distant, dulled by the void in his chest. He looked back at the house, expecting it to loom over him like a predator, but it was quiet now. Still, the door was closed, the windows dark. It looked almost normal, almost lifeless, but Elliot knew better. As he climbed into his van and drove away, he felt the weight of the house settle into his mind, a permanent, unshakable presence. And when he glanced at his reflection in the rearview mirror, he saw it again. The hallway, and at the far end, just barely visible, the shadow was waiting. Elliot wasn't sure how long he had been driving. The world outside the van seemed to blur and smear, the once familiar streets twisting into strange, unfamiliar patterns. He tried to focus, to orient himself, but every turn led back to Willow Street. He stopped the van in the middle of the road, gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. The house was there again, standing in the distance, its jagged silhouette cutting through the mist like a wound. He didn't know how he'd ended up back here. He wasn't even sure he'd ever left. The whispers returned, soft and insidious, threading through his thoughts like a melody he couldn't ignore. "Come home." Elliot slammed his fists against the dashboard, a ragged scream tearing from his throat. "Leave me alone," he shouted. "What do you want from me?" The answer came, clear and cold. "You." The door of the house was open again. Elliot didn't remember getting out of the van, but he was standing at the gate, his feet rooted to the ground, as the house seemed to lean toward him. The pull was stronger now, a tidal force dragging him forward, his body moving without his consent. He climbed the steps, the wood groaning beneath his weight, and stepped inside. The air was colder this time, the oppressive humidity replaced by a sharp, biting chill. The hallway was gone, replaced by a vast, endless void. The walls, the ceiling, the floor, they had all dissolved into darkness, leaving nothing but the faint, flickering impression of space. And then, far in the distance, he saw it, a figure. It wasn't a shadow, not this time. It was solid and terrible, its form too vast to comprehend, its edges shimmering and shifting as though it were made of something older than light. It moved slowly, deliberately, its presence filling the void with a gravity that made Elliot's knees buckle. The whispers surged, growing louder with each step the figure took. They overlapped and collided, forming a single voice that spoke directly into his mind. "You are always part of us." Elliot fell to his knees, clutching his head as the voice burrowed deeper into his thoughts. Memories flooded back, but they weren't his. He saw the faces of others, people he didn't recognize but felt connected to. He saw them walking into the house, their bodies dissolving into the walls, their voices joining the chorus. He saw himself, over and over, stepping through the doorway, each version of him older, younger, different. The house had always been there, waiting for him, shaping him, pulling him back. And now it had him. The figure stopped, its form towering over him, and for the first time, Elliot saw its face, or the absence of one. The void where a face should have been stared back at him, vast and infinite, filled with stars and impossible shapes. It leaned closer, its presence overwhelming, and Elliot felt himself unraveling. "Who are you?" he whispered, his voice trembling. The figure tilted its head, and the answer came, not in words, but in a sensation that filled him with both awe and terror. "We are the space between. We are the absence of you." Elliot's body felt weightless, his thoughts scattering like ash on the wind. He could feel the house pulling at him, dragging him into its endless void, breaking him down into nothing. He tried to resist, to hold on to something, anything, but there was nothing left. The last thing he saw before everything went dark was his own reflection in the void, staring back at him with hollow, empty eyes. And then he was gone. Elliot's consciousness drifted in the void, unmoored and unraveling. He wasn't sure how long he had been there. Time didn't seem to exist in this place. He felt himself fading, his thoughts fragmenting into pieces too small to hold together. The whispers had stopped, but their echo lingered, a soft hum that pulsed through the emptiness. Then, without warning, he felt something solid beneath him. He opened his eyes, or thought he did, and found himself standing in a room. It wasn't like any room he remembered, but it felt familiar in a way that made his stomach churn. The walls were smooth and featureless, their surface shimmering faintly as though they were alive. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of damp wood and decay. Elliot turned slowly, his breath catching as he saw the hallway stretching out before him. It was the same hallway he had seen in the mirror, the same one that had haunted his dreams. But now, it wasn't empty. The walls were lined with photographs, each one framed in black, their surfaces catching the faint, sourceless light. He approached the nearest frame, his hands trembling. The photograph showed him standing in the house's entryway, his expression vacant, his eyes dull. He moved to the next one and the next, each one showing him at a different point in his life, always within the house. Some were. From moments he remembered, a childhood birthday, a teenage argument, but they were wrong. The settings were twisted, the angles unnatural. He stepped back, his chest tightening. The photographs weren't just of him. They were of his life, rewritten and rearranged to fit the house's design. He could feel it now, the weight of the walls pressing in on him, the floor beneath his feet pulsing faintly with each beat of his heart. The whispers returned, soft and insidious, threading through his mind like a gentle melody. They weren't harsh this time. They were comforting, almost kind. "You are home." Elliot staggered, clutching his head. The air around him shimmered, and the photographs began to change. The faces blurred, the settings twisting and warping until the images became unrecognizable. The whispers grew louder, overlapping into a single, resonant voice. "You were always part of us." The floor beneath him shifted, its surface softening and folding as though it were alive. Elliot fell to his knees, his hands sinking into the pulsing surface. He tried to push himself up, but the floor seemed to grab at him, pulling him down. The walls around him began to close in, the hallway narrowing and twisting, the photographs melting into the darkness. His body felt heavy, his limbs refusing to move. The whispers filled his mind completely now, drowning out every other thought. He could feel the house pulling at him, reshaping him, rewriting him. His memories, his identity, his very sense of self. Everything was slipping away, dissolving into the walls. Elliot's last coherent thought was of the door. He pictured it in his mind, the warped wood, the peeling paint. He imagined himself stepping through it, leaving this place behind. But even as he tried to hold onto the image, it shifted, becoming something else. The door wasn't an exit. It was an entryway, not a way out, but a way in. And then he understood. The house wasn't just a building. It wasn't a place or a thing. It was alive, a living, breathing entity that consumed and transformed. It didn't just trap people, it became them. And now, it was becoming him. The walls trembled as the house exhaled, a deep, resonant groan that echoed through the void. Elliot's body dissolved into the floor, his thoughts scattering like ash. The last piece of him faded, and the house grew still. Somewhere, a door creaked open. The house stood silent on Willow Street, its weathered boards and crooked frame bathed in the pale light of dawn. To the outside world, it was just an abandoned relic, forgotten and unremarkable. But inside, the air was alive, heavy with the weight of the whispers that never ceased. Deep within its endless halls, Elliot Grayson was no longer Elliot Grayson. He was everywhere and nowhere, his thoughts scattered like fragments of glass, his voice now part of the chorus that hummed and echoed through the walls. A faint sound broke the stillness, the crunch of gravel underfoot. A young woman approached the house, her footsteps hesitant, her gaze fixed on its sagging silhouette. She was a stranger to Willow Street, drawn here by something she couldn't name. A pull, a whisper, a feeling too deep to ignore. Her eyes lingered on the gate, hanging open as if waiting for her. The air was colder here, sharper, carrying a scent that reminded her of old, forgotten places. She hesitated at the threshold, her breath visible in the chill. But the silence around her felt expectant, almost inviting. She took a step forward. Inside, the house shifted, its walls groaning softly as if waking from a long slumber. The whispers stirred, rising and falling in a strange rhythmic pattern, like a melody without end. Among them, one voice grew louder, clearer, resonating with a tone that was both familiar and alien. "Turn back." The young woman froze. She looked around, her brow furrowing. The voice was faint, almost imperceptible, but it carried a weight that made her chest tighten. She shook her head, telling herself it was just her nerves, and took another step forward. Elliot felt her presence, or at least the part of him that remained did. He could feel her hesitation, her fear, the way the house began to sink its tendrils into her thoughts. He wanted to reach her, to warn her, to stop her from taking another step. But the house wouldn't let him. His voice, twisted and distorted, joined the whispers, merging with them until it was indistinguishable. He screamed her name, though he didn't know it, begged her to leave, though he had no mouth to speak. And still, she walked deeper. The house exhaled, a deep, resonant groan that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The walls pulsed, the shadows lengthened, and the young woman stopped in the middle of the hallway. Her eyes widened as the air around her grew heavy, oppressive, the faint whispers rising to a crescendo. At the far end of the hallway, a door swung open. The space beyond it was dark, but not empty. Something moved within the shadows, its form shifting and stretching, its presence overwhelming. The whispers fell silent. "Welcome home," the house said. The door closed behind her. The air was cold and dry in the basement of the Halford Historical Society. The overhead fluorescent lights buzzed faintly, casting a sterile, unflattering glow over the rows of filing cabinets and dusty bookshelves. Margaret Dunn, the Society's lone archivist, pulled her cardigan tighter around her shoulders as she sifted through a stack of crumbling newspapers. It was a quiet job, solitary and uneventful, just the way she liked it. But tonight, something felt different. She couldn't shake the uneasy prickling at the back of her neck, as if the silence wasn't empty, but filled with something watching. She brushed the thought aside and turned back to the box of files on her desk. It was labeled simply, Willow Street. A request from a local historian looking into abandoned properties had brought her to this particular archive. Most of it was the usual fare: deeds, old photographs, zoning records. But nestled near the bottom was something unusual: a journal. Its leather cover was cracked and faded, the edges blackened as though it had been scorched. Margaret turned it over in her hands, her fingertips brushing against its brittle surface. There was no name on the cover, no indication of who it belonged to, only a faint metallic scent that clung to the pages. When she opened it, the first entry made her stomach drop. "I was here before you. I thought I could escape. I was wrong." Margaret's hands trembled as she flipped through the journal. The entries were fragmented, frantic, each one written in a different hand. Some were precise and neat, others jagged and messy, as though they had been scrawled in desperation. They all spoke of the same thing: the house on Willow Street. The words blurred as she skimmed, phrases leaping out like splinters. "It waits for us. We belong to it. It is not a house." The final entry made her freeze. "It knows you are reading this." Her breath hitched, and she snapped the journal shut. She looked around the room, suddenly hyper-aware of the oppressive quiet. The fluorescent lights flickered, and for a brief moment, the shadows in the corners of the basement seemed to stretch and shift. Margaret told herself it was just her imagination. She needed air. Leaving the journal on the desk, She climbed the narrow staircase back to the main floor of the Historical Society. The air outside was brisk, the night still and silent. She leaned against the doorway, inhaling deeply, her heart still racing. When she returned to the basement, the journal was gone. At first, she thought she'd misplaced it. She searched the desk, the floor, the box it had come from, but it was nowhere to be found. The lights flickered again, the buzzing growing louder, more insistent. She stopped, her hands trembling, and turned toward the farthest corner of the room. A photograph hung on the wall, one she'd walked past countless times without really noticing. It was old and yellowed, its edges curling slightly. The image showed a house, a crooked, sagging structure with boarded windows and a warped roofline. The address was written in faded ink at the bottom. Willow Street. Margaret's stomach churned. She stared at the photograph, her breath catching as her eyes drifted to the porch. There was someone standing there, a figure blurred and indistinct, their features just out of focus. The lights flickered again, and the shadows in the photograph seemed to shift. The figure on the porch tilted its head slightly, as if looking at her, and then it smiled. Margaret stepped back, her pulse pounding. The photograph had changed. She could see herself now, standing in the background, half obscured by the doorframe. Her reflection stared out at her, its face pale and wide-eyed, its mouth open in a silent scream. The basement door creaked behind her. She turned slowly, her body trembling as she faced the darkened staircase. From below, faint and melodic, came a whisper. "Come home."